Following my husband's death, his mother arrived at my home, bringing a moving van and an eviction order for my children and me. But she was unaware of the surprise my husband had prepared for her. I still remember the day my heart shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't just when I lost Brian, my amazing husband, at just 38 years old. No, it was the moment his own mother, Dorothy, stood over his fresh grave, looking me dead in the eye, and asked, "So, when are you finally going to move out?" Can you even imagine? With our 3 small children, all under 10, sobbing heartbroken at their dad's graveside, my grief instantly turned into pure, unadulterated rage. What the hell happened next would change our lives forever. Brian had only been gone for 8 months. 8 agonizing months since a sudden heart attack stole him from us. And now, at his very funeral, while we were still reeling from the shock and the pain, his mother thought it was the perfect time to discuss real estate. Our real estate. I stared at her, dumbfounded, and told her, "We're not going anywhere, Dorothy. This is our home." She actually laughed. A cold, dismissive sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh, we'll see about that," she sneered, "since the house is obviously mine now." See, Brian and I had bought our house 5 years ago. And yes, Dorothy had contributed $15,000 towards the down payment. And believe me, she never let us forget it. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Tuesday, that $15,000 would somehow come up. In her mind, that small contribution made her a co-owner. But according to the actual deed and the mortgage documents, it made her precisely nothing. Zero. Zilch. But Dorothy lived in her own special reality, a place where she was always right and everyone else was just too stupid to understand her brilliant logic. For months after Brian died, it became a living nightmare. She'd just show up unannounced, walking right in as if she owned the place. She'd wander through my home, a tiny notebook in hand, meticulously jotting things down, measuring rooms, snapping photos with her phone. My kids would be coloring peacefully at the kitchen table, and she'd lean over them and say, "Be careful with Grandma's walls, children." Like they were already hers. Then came the chilling pronouncement, "When I move in, the children will need to share one room so I can have a craft space and an exercise room." My blood ran cold. I kept telling her over and over, "This is our house, Dorothy. Brian left it to us. You have no claim to it." She'd just pat my hand, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face, and say, "Oh, grief makes people so confused, dear." The condescension was unbearable. Then, one Tuesday, the phone rang. It was Dorothy. "I've been very patient, Linda," she cooed, "but my patience has run out. I'm giving you 30 days to vacate my property." I couldn't help it. I actually laughed. It was a nervous, disbelieving laugh, but I did it. And then I hung up. I thought that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. Yesterday morning, at precisely 9 a.m., I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, the unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine outside. I rushed to the window, and there she was. Dorothy, standing proudly in my driveway next to a massive moving truck. She was holding papers, a triumphant grin spread across her face. And behind her? 6 men in matching t-shirts that read "Dorothy's Moving Crew." Turns out, they were just guys from her church she'd convinced to help out. She marched straight up to my door, waving those papers like a flag. "Official eviction notice," she declared. "You have 1 hour to gather your essentials. The boys will help you carry them to your car." My hands shook as I took the paper. It was a template from LegalZoom. My name was spelled wrong. The property address was missing a digit. It was a joke. "Dorothy, this isn't legal." I practically yelled. "You can't evict me from my own house." She didn't care. She just pushed past me, right into my foyer. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, dear," she simpered. Then, to the crew, "Boys, start with the living room." The churchmen looked uncomfortable, but they started to file inside. Just then, my neighbor, Jerome, walked over. Jerome, a retired property lawyer who used to swap legal advice for Brian's help with yard work, was a godsend. "Everything okay here, Linda?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. Dorothy spun around. This doesn't concern you. This is a family matter. Jerome took in the moving truck, the now frozen churchman in my doorway, and Dorothy's ridiculous eviction notice. Actually, he said, pulling out his phone, it does concern me. He showed Dorothy a document on his screen. Brian asked me to be the executor of his estate. Very thorough, young man. He set up everything properly. Dorothy's triumphant smile flickered. What does that have to do with anything? Jerome scrolled through his phone. Well, for starters, he documented every penny you claimed to have given them. Interesting thing, though. He also documented the $58,000 he and Linda loaned you over the years. He paused for emphasis. For your gambling debts. Your 3 failed businesses. That timeshare scam you fell for. Dorothy's face went crimson. Those were gifts. Not according to these signed loan agreements, Jerome countered, not missing a beat. With interest, you currently owe Linda about $73,000. Brian was too nice to collect, but as executor, I have a fiduciary duty to recover estate assets. The churchmen had started backing toward their truck, looking increasingly uneasy. Dorothy grabbed one of their arms. Don't you dare leave. I promised you lunch. But Jerome wasn't done. There's also the matter of fraud, Dorothy. See, Brian installed security cameras 3 years ago after you kept visiting when they weren't home. We have footage of you telling people at your book club that you own this house. You even rented out their garage to someone for boat storage and kept the money. That's fraud and conversion. One of the churchmen, looking utterly bewildered, spoke up. Dorothy, you said this was your house, and your daughter-in-law was squatting. Dorothy was spluttering now, her face a confused mask. They. Brian wouldn't. Jerome pulled out one more document, a wry smile playing on his lips. He said, this is my favorite part. He held up his phone and turned the screen toward Dorothy. The color drained from her face as she stared at whatever he was showing her. Jerome scrolled slowly, letting her see each page. He explained that this document listed every single time Dorothy had told someone she owned my house. 3 separate times she'd collected money by renting out parts of our property to people. The garage rental was just one instance. She'd also rented out our driveway for RV storage to a guy from her church for 6 months and kept all $400. She told a neighbor she owned the house and charged them $50 a month to park their boat trailer on our side yard. That went on for almost a year before Brian found out and made it stop. Jerome had dates, amounts, and the names of the people Dorothy had scammed. Another churchman backed away, shaking his head. He mumbled something about needing to get to his real job and that this was getting too weird for him. Dorothy lunged forward, grabbing his arm, her voice going shrill as she told him he promised to help. He pulled away from her and kept walking. The other churchmen looked at each other, then quickly followed suit. Dorothy tried to block their path, but they just walked around her like she was a piece of furniture. Within 2 minutes, they were all back in the truck. The engine roared to life, and they pulled out of my driveway without looking back. Dorothy stood there alone, her fake eviction notice crumpled in her fist. She started screaming, accusing me of turning everyone against her. Her voice got louder and higher until she was practically shrieking. She called me ungrateful, said I was stealing her son's house, and declared Brian would be ashamed of me for treating his mother this way. Jerome, bless his heart, stayed calm the entire time. He told her, very clearly, that she needed to leave the property right now. He said if she didn't leave in the next 60 seconds, he would call the police for trespassing and attempted fraud. Dorothy's face went bright red. She screamed that this was her house, that she wasn't going anywhere. Then, with a defiant huff, she marched over to my front steps and sat down. She crossed her arms, a stubborn toddler, and declared she would sit there until I admitted the house belonged to her. I looked at Jerome. He nodded toward my front door. I went inside while he stayed out there, his phone still pointed at Dorothy, recording everything. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator asked what my emergency was, and I explained that my mother-in-law was refusing to leave my property after trying to evict me with fake legal documents. The operator said officers would be there within 15 minutes. I stood at my living room window, watching Dorothy sitting on my steps like a child throwing a tantrum. Jerome stood about 10 feet away, his phone steady on her the entire time. Those 15 minutes felt like an hour, but finally, I heard sirens. A police cruiser pulled up and parked behind where the moving truck had been. Dorothy jumped up immediately and ran toward the officer getting out of his car. She started crying before she even reached him, telling him I was stealing her house and throwing her out. She wailed that her poor dead son had left her this property, and I was trying to take it from her. The officer looked tired, like he'd dealt with this kind of thing 1,000 times before. He asked to see property documents. Dorothy waved her crumpled, fake eviction notice, but the officer barely glanced at it. Jerome walked over with his phone and a stack of printed papers he'd apparently had ready in his pocket. He handed everything to the officer, who started reading through it carefully. He looked at the deed showing Brian and me as owners. He looked at the mortgage documents. He read through Jerome's meticulous documentation about the loans Dorothy owed us. He even watched some of the security footage on Jerome's phone, showing Dorothy telling her book club she owned our house. The whole time, Dorothy kept interrupting, trying to explain, making excuses. The officer held up one hand and told her to be quiet. He finished reviewing everything, then turned to Dorothy. He said, very clearly, that she needed to leave immediately or he would arrest her for trespassing. Dorothy's tears stopped like someone had flipped a switch. She demanded he arrest me instead, for elder abuse and theft. She claimed I was keeping her from her own property. The officer's expression hardened. He explained that making false reports was also a crime. He said Dorothy had exactly 2 minutes to get in her car and leave the property. He warned her that if she ever came back without permission, he would arrest her. Dorothy stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Then she finally seemed to understand this wasn't going her way. She stood up straight and pointed her finger right at my face. She screamed that I would regret this, that I had no idea what she was capable of. Then she turned, marched to her car, and slammed the door so hard I was surprised the window didn't shatter. She peeled out of my driveway fast enough to leave rubber marks on the pavement. The officer watched her go, then turned back to Jerome and me. He asked if we wanted to file a formal report. Jerome said yes immediately. The officer spent the next 20 minutes taking down every detail. He looked through all of Jerome's evidence on his phone. He wrote down the names of the churchmen who had been there. He even took photos of the tire marks Dorothy left. When he finished, he looked at me seriously. He said we should really think about getting a restraining order. He warned that Dorothy's behavior was getting worse and her delusions about owning the property were dangerous. He handed me a card with a number to call about filing for a protective order. After the officer left, I just kept thanking Jerome over and over. He waved his hand like it was nothing. He said Brian had asked him to look after us and he was just doing what his friend wanted. His eyes got a little wet when he mentioned Brian, and I had to look away before I started crying too. Jerome said he would help me file for the restraining order tomorrow. He also said we should absolutely move forward with collecting the debt Brian had so carefully documented. He was firm. Dorothy needed to face real consequences, or she would never stop. I agreed, even though part of me felt a pang of guilt. That evening, after I made dinner and got the kids cleaned up, I sat them down at the kitchen table. Aria was 9, Kristen 7, and Lucy 5. They all knew something big had happened because they'd been at school during the whole ordeal, but came home to police cars and neighbors talking in hushed tones. I explained, in the simplest way I could, that Grandma Dorothy had been confused about our house. I told them she thought it belonged to her, but it didn't. I said Grandma wouldn't be visiting for a while because she needed time to feel better. Lucy, ever innocent, asked if Grandma was mad at us. Kristen, ever sensitive, asked if we did something wrong. But it was Aria who asked the question that broke my heart. She looked right at me with Brian's eyes and asked if Grandma was sick in her brain like people get sick in their bodies. I took a deep breath. Yes, I told her, that's a very good way to think about it. Sometimes people's brains get confused about what's real and what's not. I explained that it wasn't Grandma's fault, but it also wasn't safe for her to be around us right now. Aria nodded slowly, like she understood a truth I was still grappling with. Kristen asked if Grandma would get better. I told him I hoped so, but I didn't know for sure. Lucy climbed into my lap and, with a worried frown, asked if I was sick too. I hugged her tight and promised her I was fine and that I would always, always keep them safe. After I put them to bed, I sat alone in the living room and finally let myself cry. The tears came in waves, a mixture of grief, fear, and a strange new sense of resolve. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a pounding headache, but I had things to do. Jerome had given me the name of a family lawyer he knew and trusted, so I called her office as soon as it opened. The receptionist put me through right away. I explained everything that had happened with Dorothy. The lawyer, whose name I'll just call Sarah, listened to my whole story without interrupting. Then she asked me to come in that afternoon. With all the documentation Jerome had collected, I drove over to her office at 2 p.m., carrying a thick folder. Inside were printed copies of everything Jerome had sent me: the deed to the house, the mortgage papers, Brian's loan agreements with Dorothy, logs from the security camera footage, photos of the fake eviction notice, and the police report from yesterday. Sarah spread everything out on her desk and went through it piece by piece. After about 20 minutes, she looked up at me. "Linda," she said, "we have really strong grounds for both a restraining order and debt collection." She explained that Dorothy's behavior showed a clear pattern of delusion and escalation that made her dangerous. The fake eviction attempt, combined with the harassment and trespassing, gave us plenty to work with. She said she could file for a restraining order within a few days and start the debt collection process at the same time. I signed the retainer agreement right there. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. On the drive home, my phone started ringing. Dorothy's name showed up on the screen, and I almost answered out of habit. But I remembered what Sarah said about not engaging. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. I pulled into my driveway and checked my phone. 7 missed calls from Dorothy in 15 minutes. I went inside and tried to make lunch for the kids, but my phone kept buzzing. By the time I put them down for quiet time that afternoon, Dorothy had called 37 times. I finally listened to the voicemails. They got worse with each one. The first few were her crying, accusing me of stealing her son, and now, stealing everything else. Then they got angry, her voice rising to a scream, insisting the house was hers, the money was hers, the kids were hers. By the last few messages, she was barely making sense, just rambling about Brian and lies and theft. I saved every single message exactly as Sarah had told me, and then I called her office to let them know. Her receptionist said she would add it to my file and reiterated, "Do not respond, no matter what Dorothy says." 2 days later, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. A man in a uniform stood there holding a clipboard. "Are you Linda?" he asked. I said yes, and he handed me a large envelope, asking me to sign for it. After he left, I opened it and found the cease and desist letter Sarah had drafted. It was addressed to Dorothy at her apartment and laid out very clearly that she needed to stop all contact with me and my children immediately. Any further harassment would result in legal action, including possible criminal charges. I texted Sarah to confirm Dorothy got served and got back a thumbs-up emoji. Less than an hour later, Sarah called me. She said Dorothy had just called the office, screaming threats at the receptionist. The receptionist, cool as a cucumber, had let Dorothy rant for almost 5 minutes, documenting everything she said. Dorothy threatened to sue everyone involved, claimed we were all conspiring against her, and even said she would make sure I lost my kids. Sarah said this was actually helpful because it showed Dorothy's state of mind and her willingness to make threats. Everything was being carefully documented for the restraining order filing. That evening, Rosemary showed up at my door with 2 bottles of wine and 3 pizza boxes. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. I had been holding it together pretty well since the driveway confrontation, but seeing my best friend made something crack open inside me. I started crying and I couldn't stop. She got the kids set up with pizza and a movie in the living room, then took me into the kitchen. She poured us both giant glasses of wine and just let me sob. I told her how much I missed Brian, how he would have known exactly what to say to his mother. He always managed to handle Dorothy without it turning into a huge fight. He knew how to deflect her craziness and protect us at the same time. Now I was doing it alone, and I felt like I was failing. Rosemary held my hand. "You are not failing, Linda," she said firmly. "You're protecting your kids exactly the way Brian would want you to." She reminded me that Brian had documented everything about Dorothy because he knew this might happen someday. He set up Jerome as executor because he trusted Jerome to help me. "You are doing exactly what Brian planned for, even if it hurts." Her words were a much-needed balm. The next week started normally enough. I dropped the kids at school, went to work, and tried to focus on my job instead of constantly checking my phone for Dorothy updates. At 3:15, I left work early to pick up the kids, just like always. I got to Lucy's kindergarten first, then drove over to the elementary school where Kristen and Aria went. I parked in my usual spot and walked toward the pickup area. That's when I saw her. Dorothy, standing by the playground fence, talking to Kristen through the chain link. My heart stopped. I started running toward them, fumbling for my phone to call the school office. Kristen saw me coming, and his face looked confused, a little scared. Dorothy was telling him something about going to get ice cream with Grandma. Before I could reach them, Kristen's teacher, a wonderful woman named Ms. Evans, came out and put herself squarely between Dorothy and my son. She told Dorothy she needed to leave school property immediately. Dorothy started arguing, insisting she was just talking to her grandson and had every right to see him. But Ms. Evans was already on her radio, calling the office. I reached them, and Ms. Evans recognized me, immediately ushering Kristen away from the fence toward the building. Dorothy saw me, and her face twisted with pure rage. She started yelling that I couldn't keep her away from her grandchildren. Ms. Evans got Kristen safely inside while I stood there, shaking. I wanted to scream at Dorothy, to unleash all my fear and anger, but I also didn't want to cause a bigger scene in front of all the other parents and kids. The principal came outside within 2 minutes, accompanied by the school's security officer. Dorothy was still standing at the fence, demanding to see Kristen. The principal, a no-nonsense woman, walked over to me first and asked if I was okay. I told her Dorothy was not authorized to pick up any of my children and I needed to get Kristen. She assured me he was safe inside with his teacher and that she had already called the police. Then she turned to Dorothy and told her, in a very firm voice, that she needed to leave immediately or she would be arrested for trespassing. Dorothy, of course, launched into her spiel about grandparent rights and how I was keeping her away from her family. The principal cut her off. "The school has a list of approved pickup people for every child, ma'am. You are not on Kristen's list. That means you have no right to be on school property trying to take him." I was ushered into the office and kept there while they dealt with Dorothy outside. When I finally came out, Dorothy was sitting on the curb with the security officer standing nearby. She saw me and jumped up, trying to get to me, but the security officer blocked her path. She was screaming about how I was poisoning her grandchildren against her and stealing her family. Just then, the police pulled up, lights flashing. 2 officers got out, and the principal explained what happened. Dorothy immediately started crying, telling them she just wanted to spend time with her grandson. She claimed I was keeping her away from the children for no reason and that she had rights as a grandmother. One of the officers asked to see the school's documentation, and the principal showed him my approved pickup list. Dorothy's name was conspicuously absent. The officer turned to Dorothy and explained, very clearly, that trying to take a child who wasn't released to her custody could be considered attempted custodial interference. Dorothy's face went pale. She insisted she wasn't trying to take him, she just wanted to talk to him. The officer patiently explained that wasn't how it worked and she needed to leave school property immediately and not come back. Dorothy looked at me with pure hatred, then got in her car and drove away. I finally got to see Kristen, and he ran into my arms, asking why Grandma was there. The principal said I should take him home, and they would handle the paperwork. I called Sarah from the car, and she said to come straight to her office. I picked up Aria and Lucy from their classrooms and drove to Sarah's office with all 3 kids. Sarah took one look at my face and got me water while her assistant gave the kids coloring books. I explained everything that happened at the school, and she started typing immediately. She said this was exactly the kind of escalation that justified an emergency restraining order. She would file the paperwork that afternoon and request an emergency hearing. The judge granted a temporary order within 3 hours and scheduled a full hearing for 2 weeks out. The temporary order was clear. Dorothy could not contact me or the children, could not come within 500 feet of our home or their schools, and could not make any attempts to see or communicate with them. Sarah said the police would serve Dorothy with the order that very night. That night, after dinner, I sat down with Kristen at the kitchen table. Aria and Lucy were watching TV in the living room, and I needed to talk to him alone. I asked him what Grandma said to him at the school. He looked down at his hands, his small voice barely a whisper. He said she told him I was keeping them apart because I was mean. She said she missed him and wanted to take him for ice cream. I took a deep breath and explained that Grandma was very sad about Daddy dying, and sometimes when people are very sad, their brains get confused. I told him Grandma wasn't thinking clearly, and that's why she tried to take him from the school without permission. He asked if Grandma was going to jail like the bad guys on TV. I said no, but Grandma couldn't visit for a while because we needed to keep everyone safe. I promised him that I would always protect him and his sisters, no matter what. He hugged me and said he missed Daddy. I held him tight and told him I missed Daddy too, but we were going to be okay. The next morning, Jerome came over, not just with legal advice, but with boxes of security equipment. He said after what happened at the school, we needed better cameras, covering every single entrance to the house. He spent 3 hours installing cameras at the front door, back door, garage, and both side gates. He showed me how to access the footage on my phone and gave me the number for a security company that could monitor the feeds. I stood in my kitchen watching him work, and I felt like I was preparing for war. This wasn't normal life. This was defending my home and my children from my dead husband's mother. Jerome finished installing the last camera and came inside for coffee. He sat down at my table and said Brian would be proud of how I was handling everything. I told him it didn't feel like I was handling it well at all. He shook his head. You are doing exactly what needs to be done to protect those kids, Linda. That's all that matters. After he left, I checked all the camera feeds on my phone and made sure everything was working. Then I locked every door and window in the house, even though it was the middle of the day. A new kind of vigilance had settled over me. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said, "This is Estelle, Dorothy's sister, and I need to talk to you about what happened." I sat down at the kitchen table, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Estelle said she'd heard about the driveway incident from someone at Dorothy's church, and she was so sorry. She told me Dorothy had always had problems with reality, and the family had been enabling her behavior for decades. Estelle admitted they all knew Dorothy twisted facts and made up stories, but nobody wanted to deal with the drama of calling her out. Watching it get this bad, she said, with you and the kids, it made me realize we failed Brian by not stepping in sooner. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened while she kept talking. Estelle told me she knew about Dorothy's gambling debts from years ago and the failed businesses where she lost money. What she didn't know was that Brian had been bailing his mother out financially for all those years. She said if she'd known Brian was covering Dorothy's mistakes, she would have said something to him about stopping. I told her about the restraining order hearing coming up in a week, and she went quiet for a minute. Then she said she wanted to help and asked if she could testify about Dorothy's history of delusion and manipulation. I gave her Sarah's contact information and thanked her for calling. After we hung up, I sat there feeling strange about the whole conversation. Part of me was glad someone from Brian's family finally acknowledged how bad Dorothy was. Another part of me was angry that they'd all watched this happen and done nothing until now. 3 days before the hearing, my phone rang again, and this time it was Coleman, Brian's younger brother. I hadn't heard from him since the funeral, and his voice sounded tight and angry when he said my name. He told me he'd just found out what Dorothy had been telling their entire extended family about me. According to Dorothy, I had forged Brian's will to cut her out and stolen all his life insurance money for myself. She'd been calling aunts and uncles and cousins for weeks, spreading these hateful lies. Coleman said he'd been getting calls from relatives asking if it was true, and he'd had no idea what they were talking about. He spent the last 2 days doing damage control and showing people the actual documents proving Dorothy was lying. Some relatives believed him, but others thought he was taking my side against his own mother. The whole family was split now over Dorothy's lies, and Coleman was furious with her. He asked what he could do to help, and I told him about the restraining order hearing. He said he'd write a statement for Sarah about Dorothy's behavior and the lies she'd been spreading. I thanked him and told him I was sorry his mother had put him in this position. He said he was sorry, too, and that Brian would have been ashamed of what Dorothy was doing to his family. The day before the hearing, a mail carrier knocked on my door with a certified letter. I signed for it and opened the envelope right there on my front step. Inside was a legal document claiming Dorothy was suing me for elder abuse, fraud, and alienation of affection from her grandchildren. The language was formal and official-looking, but I could tell it wasn't filed through an actual court. I called Sarah immediately and read her the whole thing over the phone. She actually laughed. She said it was complete nonsense, with no legal basis whatsoever. Dorothy couldn't sue for alienation of affection from grandchildren because that wasn't even a real cause of action. The elder abuse and fraud claims were equally ridiculous, especially since Dorothy had been the one committing fraud. Sarah said the letter actually helped our case because it showed Dorothy's mental state was getting worse. She was so disconnected from reality that she thought she could just make up legal claims and sue people. I put the letter in my folder of Dorothy documents and tried not to think about the hearing tomorrow. The next morning, I put on my best professional clothes and drove to the courthouse with Sarah. Jerome met us there, all his documentation printed and organized in binders. Estelle showed up, looking nervous but determined. Coleman arrived last and gave me a hug before we all went inside. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with plain walls and uncomfortable wooden benches. Dorothy was already there, sitting alone at a table on the other side of the room. She was dressed up in a suit and had papers spread out in front of her. Sarah whispered that Dorothy was representing herself, which was a huge mistake for her, but good for us. The judge came in, and we all stood up. She was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and reading glasses who looked tired, but completely professional. Sarah went first and presented everything in a clear, organized way. She showed the fake eviction notice and explained how Dorothy had brought a moving truck to my house. She described the school incident where Dorothy tried to take Kristen without permission. She played recordings of Dorothy's harassing phone calls and read transcripts of her threatening voicemails. Jerome presented his documentation of Dorothy's fraud, including the security camera footage of her telling people she owned my house. He showed the signed loan agreements proving Dorothy owed the estate $73,000. Estelle testified about Dorothy's lifelong pattern of delusions and how the family had enabled her behavior for decades. Coleman's written statement described the lies Dorothy had been spreading to relatives about me, accusing me of forging documents and stealing money. The judge listened carefully, taking notes, her expression unchanging. Then it was Dorothy's turn. She stood up, clutching her papers. Dorothy started talking, and within 30 seconds, I could see the judge's expression change. Dorothy rambled about how she'd given us money for the house, which made it hers by right. She declared that possession was 9/10 of the law, and Brian had always intended for her to live with us. She claimed I was keeping her grandchildren from her because I was jealous of her relationship with Brian. Nothing she said made any logical sense, and she kept jumping from topic to topic without finishing a thought. She insisted she had rights as a mother and as a property owner, and the court needed to recognize those rights. The judge tried to interrupt her several times to ask specific questions, but Dorothy just kept talking over her, steamrolling any attempt at order. After about 10 minutes, the judge, her voice sharp, told Dorothy to sit down and stop speaking. Dorothy ignored her and kept going, so the judge raised her voice. "Sit down now." Dorothy finally stopped talking and sat down, looking confused about why the judge was angry. The judge took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Then she looked directly at Dorothy. She said she was granting a full restraining order for 1 year. Dorothy could not contact me or the children in any way. She could not come within 500 feet of our home or the children's schools. And, importantly, she could not make any claims about property ownership regarding my house. The judge stated that the evidence showed a clear pattern of harassment, delusion, and escalating dangerous behavior. Dorothy jumped up, screaming that the judge was corrupt and bought off by my lawyer. 2 bailiffs moved toward her. The judge warned her to stop or face contempt charges. Dorothy kept screaming that this was all illegal, that she had rights, and that everyone was conspiring against her. The bailiffs took her arms and started walking her toward the door. Dorothy twisted around to look at me, yelling that I'd stolen everything from her and I'd pay for it. They got her out into the hallway, and I could still hear her yelling until a door closed somewhere, muffling her cries. The judge told Sarah the order would be served to Dorothy within 24 hours, and any violations would result in immediate arrest. She added that, based on Dorothy's behavior in court, she was also recommending a mental health evaluation. We thanked the judge and walked out of the courtroom. In the hallway outside, I stopped and leaned against the wall, feeling like I might throw up. Sarah touched my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't really okay. Part of me felt an immense wave of relief that the judge had taken this seriously and protected us. Another part felt terrible about what had just happened. Brian would have been so sad to see his mother like that, screaming in a courtroom and getting dragged out by bailiffs. But Brian would also want his children safe and protected, and that's what I was doing. That's what he couldn't do anymore because he was gone. Jerome walked over and said I'd done the right thing and Brian would be proud. Estelle hugged me and said she was sorry her family had let things get this bad. Coleman said he'd make sure the rest of the family knew what really happened today. The next week, Sarah filed a civil suit to collect the $73,000 Dorothy owed Brian's estate. Dorothy, predictably, responded with a letter claiming all the money had been gifts, not loans. But Jerome's documentation included signed loan agreements for most of the money, with Dorothy's signature clearly visible on every page. Some of the loans were from 10 years ago, some were more recent, but they all had the same pattern. Brian would loan his mother money, and she'd sign an agreement to pay it back. She never paid back a single dollar. Sarah said collecting the actual money would be hard since Dorothy had no assets and no real income. But having the court judgment mattered for the legal record and for my kids to see someday. They needed to know their father had been generous to his mother, and she'd taken advantage of that generosity for years. Over the next month, word spread through Dorothy's church and her social circles about what happened at the courthouse. Several people who knew Brian reached out to me through Facebook or email. They said they'd always suspected Dorothy had problems, but didn't realize how serious it was. One woman from Brian's old neighborhood told me Dorothy used to tell people she owned multiple properties when she only rented an apartment. Another person said Dorothy had borrowed money from them years ago and never paid it back. A man from Brian's work said Dorothy had shown up there once, claiming Brian owed her thousands of dollars and demanding the company pay her directly. Everyone had stories about Dorothy's lies and delusions, but nobody had connected all the pieces until now. I saved every message and forwarded them to Sarah in case we needed more evidence later. It felt strange to have all these people suddenly validating what I'd been dealing with alone for months. Part of me wished they'd spoken up sooner, but I understood why they hadn't. Nobody wants to be the person who says someone's mother is delusional and dangerous. 2 days after all those messages came in, I made appointments with a therapist named Danielle Reyes, who specialized in childhood grief and family problems. Rosemary had recommended her after the school incident, saying her own kids had seen Danielle years ago after a divorce. The waiting room had soft chairs and toys in the corner. Aria sat next to me looking nervous, while Kristen played with a puzzle on the floor. Lucy kept asking if this was a doctor's office and if she was getting a shot. Danielle came out to meet us, and she had this calm, grounding energy that made me feel like maybe we could actually talk about the hard stuff. She saw each kid separately first, then all 3 together. then asked to speak with me alone. When I came back to get them an hour later, Aria had been crying. In the car, she told me she'd been having nightmares about Grandma taking them away from me and putting them in different houses. She said in the dreams I was calling for them, but they couldn't find me. Kristen said he felt bad that Grandma was sad, but also scared of her because she acted like the rules didn't apply to her. He asked Danielle if Grandma might try to take him from the school again, and Danielle had apparently told him we had safety plans now to prevent that. Lucy mostly seemed confused about why Grandma couldn't visit anymore, asking if Grandma was sick or if we were mad at her. Danielle had helped me explain it in ways a 5-year-old could understand, focusing on the idea that sometimes people who love us still make choices that aren't safe. We talked about how we keep people safe by having rules and boundaries, and how Grandma needed to learn to follow those rules before she could visit again. Lucy accepted this better than I expected, probably because she was too young to fully grasp everything that had happened. We scheduled weekly appointments for the next month, and Danielle said she'd work with each kid on processing their father's death, alongside the stress from Dorothy's behavior. That same week, Jerome called and asked me to come over to his house because he had something to show me. I walked over after the kids got on the school bus and found him sitting at his computer in his home office with multiple video files pulled up. He said he'd been going through the security footage from 3 years ago. The cameras Brian had installed after Dorothy kept visiting when we weren't home. What he found made my stomach turn. The footage showed Dorothy taking things from our house. Small items like framed photos from the mantel, Brian's childhood books from the den, family heirlooms that had been Brian's grandmother's. She was literally stealing from us while pretending to just visit and check on things. Jerome had compiled clips spanning 6 months where Dorothy came into the house with her key, looked around to make sure nobody was home, then took items and put them in her purse or a shopping bag she'd brought. In one clip, she spent 20 minutes going through our bedroom drawers. In another, she was in Brian's office, going through files and taking papers. Jerome said this was theft, plain and simple, and it gave us additional leverage in the civil suit. I felt sick watching my dead husband's mother stealing from us, violating our home, taking things that belonged to our children. Brian had known something was wrong. That's why he installed the cameras, but I don't think even he realized how bad it was. Sarah added theft charges to the civil suit the next day after reviewing all of Jerome's footage. A week later, Dorothy's public defender from the criminal trespassing case contacted Sarah about a possible settlement. Dorothy was facing misdemeanor charges for the fake eviction attempt and the school incident. And apparently, her public defender wanted to work out a deal before things got worse. Sarah said Dorothy's legal situation was getting complicated because she had the criminal charges, the civil suit for the debt, and now additional theft charges, all piling up at once. The public defender suggested Dorothy might plead guilty to the trespassing charges in exchange for probation and dropping the school incident charge. Sarah said we should consider it because getting a guaranteed conviction was better than risking a trial where Dorothy might get sympathetic jury members. I told her I wanted Dorothy to face real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist. But I also understood that dragging this through courts for months would be exhausting for me and the kids. The same week, a family court mediator named Harold Tate reached out through Sarah to see if I'd be willing to discuss supervised visitation for Dorothy with the children. He said his job was to facilitate family relationships when possible, and he understood there were serious issues, but wanted to explore options. I called him back directly and told him, absolutely not. Not until Dorothy gets serious mental health treatment and shows real change over time. I explained that my children were already in therapy dealing with their father's death and their grandmother's behavior, and I wasn't going to expose them to more trauma just because Dorothy wanted access. Harold listened patiently. He said he understood my position and that any future discussions about visitation would require documented mental health treatment and compliance with all court orders. He said he'd note in his file that I was open to revisiting the issue if Dorothy demonstrated sustained change, but that protecting my children was my first priority. I appreciated that he didn't push or make me feel guilty for setting boundaries. A few days later, Coleman showed up at my door with his wife and their 2 kids. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, and I was nervous about what he might say, but he hugged me immediately and apologized for not stepping in sooner. His kids ran off to play with Aria, Kristen, and Lucy while the adults sat in the kitchen. Coleman said he'd been in therapy himself for the past month, trying to deal with growing up with Dorothy as a mother. His therapist had helped him see how much he'd been enabling her behavior by staying silent. His wife said they'd always known Dorothy had problems, but didn't realize how bad things had gotten until the driveway incident. Coleman asked how the kids were doing, and I told him about the therapy appointments and the nightmares. He looked pained. "I'm so sorry, Linda," he said. "My mother has no right to do this to them. They deserve better than having their grandmother act like this after losing their father." Coleman started sharing stories about Dorothy's behavior throughout his and Brian's childhood. And suddenly, so much made sense. He said Dorothy used to tell neighbors they owned a vacation house when they were actually renting a cabin for 1 week a year. She'd claim Brian's father made twice his actual salary and then be confused when bills didn't get paid. She borrowed money from Brian's grandmother and never paid it back, then got mad when the grandmother changed her will. She told people at church that Coleman was going to medical school when he'd actually decided to become a teacher, and she got angry at him for embarrassing her when the truth came out. The lies, the financial manipulation, the delusions about being owed things. It had all been there for decades. Brian had apparently protected me from the worst of it for years, handling his mother himself, running interference so I didn't have to deal with her directly as much. Coleman said Brian used to call him late at night, stressed about their mother's latest crisis or demand. And Brian always felt guilty for not being able to fix her. Hearing this made me miss Brian even more, but it also made me grateful he documented everything with Jerome. He knew his mother was a problem, and he tried to protect us even after he was gone. That evening, Estelle called with news about Dorothy. She said Dorothy had lost her apartment because she'd stopped paying rent 3 months ago, claiming she was about to move into her house, so why bother paying? The landlord had finally evicted her, and she was now living in a motel on the edge of town, burning through what little money she had. Estelle said she'd tried to help Dorothy find a new apartment, but Dorothy refused to look at anything, insisting she'd be moving into my house soon, once the courts fixed their mistake. Dorothy was apparently telling people at her church that I'd bribed the judge, and that's why she lost in court. Estelle sounded tired and sad. She said she was done trying to help her sister if Dorothy wouldn't accept reality. I thanked her for letting me know and told her I appreciated her being honest about Dorothy's problems instead of making excuses like she used to. Part of me felt terrible that Dorothy was struggling, living in a motel, and losing everything because of her own delusions. But when I mentioned this to Sarah during our next call, she reminded me firmly that these were consequences of Dorothy's own choices. Dorothy had chosen to stop paying rent. Dorothy had chosen to try to evict me illegally. Dorothy had chosen to violate boundaries and make threats and show up at my kids' school. Nobody had forced her to do any of those things. Sarah said I couldn't set myself on fire to keep Dorothy warm, especially not with 3 kids depending on me for stability and safety. She was right. I had to focus on my children and their needs, not on managing Dorothy's self-destructive behavior. Brian would have wanted me to protect our kids first, even if it meant his mother faced hard consequences. The civil suit moved forward over the next several weeks. Dorothy missed court dates, didn't respond to filings, and continued to claim the whole thing was a conspiracy against her. Her public defender eventually withdrew from representing her in the civil case, saying she wouldn't cooperate or follow legal advice. Dorothy tried to file her own motions, but they were full of errors and got rejected by the court clerk. Sarah said Dorothy was making this easier by refusing to participate properly in her own defense. Finally, the judge ruled in my favor by default and ordered Dorothy to pay the $73,000 plus court costs and legal fees. The judgment wouldn't be easy to collect since Dorothy had no assets and no stable income, but it was now part of the legal record. Sarah filed the paperwork to garnish any future wages or benefits Dorothy might receive. And she said we could revisit collection efforts if Dorothy ever got money from somewhere. For now, the important thing was having the court officially recognize that Dorothy owed us money, not the other way around, and that all her claims about owning our house or being owed anything were legally baseless. Sarah called me 2 days after the judgment to go over what happens next with collecting the money. I drove to her office and sat across from her desk while she pulled up spreadsheets and court documents on her computer. She explained that Dorothy had no real assets, no property, no savings accounts that showed up in any searches. Her only income was Social Security, which we could garnish, but there were limits on how much we could take from those payments each month. Sarah said it might take years, maybe decades, to see even half of what Dorothy owed. She could file paperwork to start garnishing any future wages if Dorothy ever got a job, and we could seize any tax refunds or unexpected windfalls. But realistically, Dorothy would probably die before paying off the full amount. I sat there looking at the numbers and realized I didn't actually care about getting the money back. What mattered was the legal record showing the truth. Brian had loaned his mother all that money trying to help her, being a good son, and she'd twisted it into claims that we owed her. Now, there was a court document, official and permanent, stating that Dorothy owed us $73,000, not the other way around. My kids would grow up, and someday they'd read these papers and understand their father was generous. Maybe too generous, but he tried to help his mother even when she didn't deserve it. That was Brian's memory, and it deserved to be protected. I told Sarah to file the garnishment paperwork, but I wasn't going to spend energy chasing Dorothy for money she'd never have. 3 months passed after the restraining order went into effect, and I started to relax a little. Dorothy hadn't shown up, hadn't called, hadn't tried anything. The kids were settling into their new normal without her constant presence and demands. Then Coleman called me on a Tuesday morning, sounding stressed. He said he'd received a package at his house addressed to him. But when he opened it, he found 3 separate letters inside, each one addressed to one of my kids. Dorothy had mailed them to Coleman's address, clearly hoping he'd just pass them along to the children without telling me. Coleman, being the stand-up guy he was, didn't even read them. He sealed them back up, took photos of everything, including the postmarks and Dorothy's return address, and drove straight to Sarah's office. Sarah contacted the police immediately and filed a violation report. By that afternoon, officers went to Dorothy's motel and arrested her for violating the protective order. She apparently argued with them the whole way to the station, insisting she had a right to write to her grandchildren and that sending letters through her son didn't count as direct contact. Dorothy spent 3 days in county jail before her hearing. The judge was not amused. He added stricter conditions to her release, including electronic monitoring, and told her plainly that the next violation would result in serious jail time, not just a few days. Coleman visited her after she got out and called me that evening to tell me about it. He said she seemed genuinely shocked that she'd been arrested, like she couldn't understand why rules applied to her. She kept saying she was just trying to be a good grandmother, that I was poisoning the children against her, that everyone was being so unfair. Coleman finally told her she'd brought this all on herself, and until she accepted reality and got real help, he couldn't support her behavior anymore. He said it was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had with his mother, but he was done enabling her delusions. The kids kept going to therapy every week with Danielle, and I started seeing real progress. Aria told me one morning while I was making breakfast that she hadn't had any nightmares about Grandma Dorothy in over a month. She said she used to dream that Dorothy was taking them away and I couldn't find them. But now she felt safe knowing Dorothy couldn't just show up anymore. Kristen had been quieter than usual for weeks. But one Saturday afternoon, he came into the kitchen and asked if we could plant a tree for Daddy in the backyard. He said his teacher had talked about memorial trees, and he thought Daddy would like having a strong tree that would grow big. I felt tears starting, but I smiled and told him that was a perfect idea. We went to the nursery that afternoon, and Kristen picked out an oak tree, saying oaks lived for hundreds of years and got really tall. Aria and Lucy came with us, and we spent the whole afternoon digging the hole, mixing in good soil, and carefully planting the tree in the back corner of the yard where it would get lots of sun. We stood around it when we finished and said we should each say something to Daddy. Lucy said she loved him and missed him. Aria said she hoped he was proud of us. Kristen said he'd take care of the tree and make sure it grew strong. I told Brian we were okay, we were safe, and we'd never forget him. Rosemary came over a few weeks later and found me staring at the boxes of Brian's things I'd been avoiding since he died. She didn't say anything, just sat down next to me and started opening the first box. We spent hours going through his clothes, his books, his random collections of things he'd saved. Inside were letters. Lots of them. Each one addressed to one of the kids, with dates written on the outside. Letters for their 10th birthdays, their 13th birthdays, their high school graduations, their college graduations, their wedding days. Brian had written them all, knowing his heart was a problem, knowing he might not be there for these moments. I sobbed reading the first few, seeing his handwriting, hearing his voice in the words. He told Aria to be brave and kind. He told Kristen to follow his curiosity and never stop learning. He told Lucy she was his sunshine and to never lose her joy. At the bottom of the stack was one more letter addressed to me, with no date, just the word now written on it. I opened Brian's letter to me with shaking hands and read his words through tears that wouldn't stop. He wrote that he was sorry about his mother, that he knew how hard she made things, that he'd tried for years to manage her and protect us from the worst of it. He said he loved his mother, but he also knew she was toxic, that her problems weren't my responsibility to fix, and that I should never let her guilt me into anything. He wrote that his family was me and the kids, that we came first always, no exceptions, no matter what Dorothy claimed or demanded. He made me promise not to sacrifice our peace and safety, trying to maintain a relationship with someone who refused to respect boundaries or accept reality. He said he trusted me to do what was right for our children, even if it meant cutting his mother out completely, and he'd support that choice from wherever he was. The letter ended with him telling me I was stronger than I knew, that I'd be an amazing mother to our kids, and that he loved me more than anything in the world. I took that letter and bought a simple frame for it the next day. I hung it on my bedroom wall where I'd see it every morning when I woke up and every night before bed. Reading Brian's words, seeing his clear statement that protecting our children from Dorothy was what he wanted, made the guilt I'd been carrying start to lift. I'd spent months wondering if I was being too harsh, if Brian would want me to be more understanding with his mother, if I was keeping the kids from their grandmother unfairly. But here was proof, in his own handwriting, that he knew exactly who his mother was. And he wanted me to put our family first. The determination that had been growing in me since the driveway confrontation solidified into something unshakable. I wasn't being cruel or vindictive. I was being a mother, protecting my children, honoring my husband's wishes. 6 months after Dorothy showed up with that moving truck, her public defender called Sarah about a plea deal. Dorothy would plead guilty to criminal trespassing for the fake eviction attempt and to violating the restraining order for sending the letters through Coleman. In exchange, she'd get probation instead of more jail time and mandatory mental health treatment. The prosecutor wanted to close the case, and the public defender said Dorothy was finally willing to admit she needed help. Sarah called me to discuss whether I'd agree to the deal. I thought about it for 2 days before giving my answer. I told Sarah I'd agree to the plea deal, but only with specific conditions. The restraining order had to stay in place for the full year with no modifications. Dorothy had to complete at least 6 months of mental health treatment with documented progress reports before we'd even discuss the possibility of supervised visitation with the kids. Any future contact had to go through the family court mediator and follow strict guidelines. And if Dorothy violated any part of the agreement, the deal was off, and she'd face the full criminal penalties. Sarah presented my conditions to the prosecutor and Dorothy's public defender. They agreed to everything. The judge approved the arrangement at a hearing I didn't have to attend, and Dorothy officially pleaded guilty to both charges. She was sentenced to 2 years probation, mandatory therapy twice a week, and continued electronic monitoring for 6 months. A few weeks after the plea deal, Coleman called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. He said Dorothy had actually started going to her therapy appointments, and the therapist diagnosed her with something called delusional disorder. They put her on medication, and Coleman said she seemed different now, less angry and aggressive, more confused about why she'd believed the things she believed about the house. He told me she'd asked him why she thought the house was hers when the papers clearly showed it wasn't. Like, she was genuinely puzzled by her own behavior. I listened to him talk and felt this weird mix of hope and caution, like maybe things could get better, but I wasn't ready to bet on it. I told Coleman I was glad she was getting help, but my priority had to be protecting the kids. If Dorothy really got better over time, maybe someday we could talk about supervised visits, but I wouldn't risk my children's safety and peace on him maybe. Coleman said he understood, and he'd keep me updated on her progress without pushing for anything. The next month, Estelle started coming by the house on Saturday afternoons. She'd bring cookies or craft supplies and sit with the kids at the kitchen table, telling them stories about Brian when he was little. Aria loved hearing about how Brian once tried to build a treehouse and fell out of the tree twice in one day. Kristen laughed when Estelle described Brian's terrible attempts at cooking as a teenager. Lucy just liked having another adult around who paid attention to her. Estelle was nothing like Dorothy, calm and respectful, asking permission before coming over and never overstaying her welcome. She never mentioned the house or the legal stuff or tried to make excuses for her sister. I found myself actually enjoying her visits and feeling grateful that Brian's family wasn't completely toxic. Jerome started coming over more often too. Not just to check on legal stuff, but to spend time with the kids. He taught Kristen how to play chess on our back porch, setting up an old wooden board and explaining each piece with patience. He helped Aria with her math homework when she got frustrated with fractions, showing her tricks for remembering how to work the problems. I'd watch them together and realize Brian had surrounded us with good people, folks who would step up and be there when he couldn't be here anymore. Jerome never tried to replace Brian or act like a substitute father. He was just present and kind and steady. One Saturday in early fall, I decided to repaint the living room. Dorothy used to criticize this room constantly, saying the color was too dark and made the space feel small. I picked a warm cream color and spent the whole day rolling paint onto the walls while the kids played in the backyard. When I finished, the room looked completely different, brighter and more open. I moved furniture around to suit us, instead of keeping it the way Dorothy had arranged it years ago when she helped us move in. The house started feeling like ours in a way it hadn't before. Not because we'd won some legal battle, but because I'd claimed it as our space without her shadow hanging over everything. At work, my boss called me into her office one Monday morning, and I thought something was wrong. Instead, she offered me a promotion to senior account manager with better pay and more flexible hours. The extra money would help with everything. Raising 3 kids alone was expensive, even with Brian's life insurance and pension. I accepted the promotion and felt proud of myself for managing all of this, the legal stuff, and the kids, and work, and keeping everything together. On what would have been Brian's 39th birthday in October, we drove to the cemetery with his favorite chocolate cake. The kids sat on the grass near his headstone and told him about school and their friends. Aria talked about her science project on butterflies. Kristen described his new teacher who let them have class outside sometimes. Lucy sang him a song she'd learned in kindergarten. I told Brian we were okay, we were safe, and I was keeping the promise I'd made to protect our family. 6 months after Dorothy started therapy, her therapist sent a report to the court through the mediator. The report said Dorothy had made significant progress in treatment. She'd accepted that the house wasn't hers and never had been. She'd accepted that she owed money rather than being owed money. She'd acknowledged that her behavior had been harmful to me and the kids. Harold Tate called me to discuss next steps and suggested starting with supervised video calls before any in-person visits. I thought about it for a few days before agreeing to try one call. The first video call happened on a Saturday afternoon with Harold monitoring from his office. Dorothy appeared on the screen looking older and tired, her hair grayer than I remembered. She asked the kids about school and listened when they answered. She didn't mention the house or make demands or act like she had any claim to anything. The call lasted 20 minutes and stayed appropriate the whole time. We scheduled monthly video calls and kept them going for 3 months. Dorothy remained stable and appropriate each time, asking questions about the kids' activities and telling them she missed them. During the 3rd call, she looked at me and apologized for everything she'd put us through. She said she was sorry for showing up with the moving truck and scaring the kids and making everything so hard after Brian died. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I told her that honestly, but I appreciated that she'd said it. The kids seemed less tense around her on the screen than they'd been in person before all this started. After those 3 months of stable video calls, Coleman reached out to suggest an in-person visit at a park halfway between our houses. He said he and his wife would be there the whole time, and Dorothy understood this was a trial run with strict limits. I agreed, but told the kids ahead of time that we were meeting Grandma in a public place and could leave whenever we wanted. The morning of the visit, Aria asked 3 times if Grandma was going to try taking our house again, and I promised her, no, honey. Those days are over. We arrived at the park and found Coleman and his wife already there with Dorothy sitting on a bench. She stood up when she saw us, and I watched her carefully, looking for any sign of the old Dorothy who would have rushed over making demands. Instead, she waited for us to approach and said hello quietly. She'd brought small gifts, coloring books for Lucy and Kristen, a science kit for Aria. Nothing expensive or over the top. The kids stayed close to me at first, and Dorothy didn't push. She just asked Kristen about his favorite subject in school and listened when he talked about art class. Lucy warmed up faster than the older two and showed Dorothy a drawing she'd made. By the end of the hour, Lucy walked over and hugged Dorothy before we left. I saw tears in Dorothy's eyes, but she didn't make a big deal about it. Coleman walked me to my car after and said his mother had been working hard in therapy and understood she'd almost lost her grandchildren forever. A week later, Harold Tate called to schedule a meeting about establishing permanent visitation rules. I met with him and Dorothy in his office and laid out exactly what I needed. Visits only at neutral locations like parks or restaurants. Never at my house or hers. No discussion of the house, the money she owed, or anything related to the legal battles. No undermining my parenting decisions or telling the kids things should be different. Continued therapy required, with regular reports to the court. If she violated any of these rules, even once, visits would stop immediately. Dorothy listened to everything and agreed to all of it. Harold drafted a formal agreement, and Dorothy signed it in front of both of us. He made copies for everyone and told Dorothy this was her chance to rebuild relationships slowly and carefully. She thanked him, and she thanked me for giving her this opportunity. I didn't say I forgave her, because I wasn't there yet. Maybe wouldn't ever be fully. But I could give her supervised time with her grandchildren if she stayed stable and appropriate. A year after that harrowing morning, when Dorothy showed up with the moving truck and fake eviction notice, life looked completely different. Dorothy saw the kids once a month at various parks and restaurants, always with Coleman or his wife present. She stayed appropriate every single time, brought small, thoughtful gifts, asked about their lives, and never once mentioned the house. Or money. At work, I'd moved up to senior account manager and loved my team and projects. The extra money helped with everything from kids' activities to home repairs. Aria joined the science club at school and won second place at the regional fair. Kristen discovered he loved drawing and filled sketchbooks with elaborate pictures. Lucy started first grade and made friends easily. Her kindergarten teacher said she was thriving. Our house felt secure and peaceful in a way it hadn't since before Brian died. Maybe even before that, given how Dorothy used to show up and criticize everything. I'd repainted most rooms, rearranged furniture to suit us, and planted new flowers in the front yard that were mine, not something Dorothy had opinions about. Jerome still came over regularly, and the kids called him Mr. Jerome now, asking him to help with homework or teach them card games. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone different from the grieving widow who'd been too patient with Dorothy's boundary violations. I knew how to protect my family now, how to stand firm even when it felt uncomfortable, how to enforce consequences when people cross lines. Brian would be proud of how I'd fought for our children and our home against his own mother. I was proud of myself, too, for learning to be strong in ways I never had to be when he was alive. We were building a good life, the 4 of us, with help from people like Jerome and Coleman and Rosemary. The kids still missed their dad and always would, but they were happy and healthy and felt safe in their home. That's what mattered most, what Brian would have wanted most. And I'd made sure we got there, even when his mother tried to take it all. What would you have done in my place, facing such a challenging situation right after a devastating loss? Have you ever had to draw such a hard line with family? Tell me what you think, I really want to know.